My name is Kevin Bandy. I work at FanDuel, specifically on our sportsbook app. So we do sports betting, and we actually have our origins in the UK. I believe it's a little bit more popular to get into betting and sports betting out there, but we found an opportunity here in the US, and so FanDuel has become a well-known brand. If you've been watching any of the NBA lately, there's a lot of FanDuel ads. We're really kind of throwing some ad spend that direction. For me, it's a point of pride to see our brand all over the place. We're really making a push. Our big thing is whenever online gambling becomes legal, we go into that state, and all of this surrounds our app. Our app is built in React Native so that we can support Android and iOS, and a big part of that play as well is we want this one consistent code base that we can allow a lot of engineers to work together on. So we have well over 100 engineers that work specifically on this app. We have over 1,000 in product specifically around this app. It is a large, fairly large scale. It's the largest I've worked on, certainly for a mobile app. I've worked on large SaaS products before, but when you talk about mobile, everything's a little bit different. So the big thing that shocked me when I moved into React Native and mobile was going from, oops, we made a mistake, and an hour later we can deploy a fix, to, wait a minute, you are blocked by the App Store, and it's a whole different process. So you have to evaluate things a little bit differently and have a different mindset in the mobile world. And when I was researching ways that we can split up this code and work better as a company, it was a little bit different, a little uncharted in the mobile world. So I want to start with the context that when I joined the team, I was working with a group that's tasked with modularizing our code base. So the idea there was how do we find a way that all of our engineers can have ownership over their part of the code, work together, and continue to build a world-class app. So what we started to dig into is the monorepo approach and some tooling around it called NX. But because I started this entire presentation and the title talking about NX, I feel like I should talk about it a little bit first. NX is a build tool. It's a build system for monorepo projects, and I'm going to dive into the definition of monorepo and everything about that in a bit here. It's maintained by a company called Narwhal, NRWL, as you see there. And they also have another build system called Lerna. They also support Lerna, if you've heard of that. And you might wonder, well, if they have both of these, why would you choose one over the other? Well, at scale and for a monorepo project, NX has the key advantage of speed. So between the two of those, that's the big advantage there. There are a lot of other tools available, and I think a few of them were even in this keynote this morning. And we did evaluate a few others. We looked at Yarn workspaces and things like that, but we settled on NX for our solution. All right, so definitions again. Talking about monorepos in particular, this is where the term polyrepo comes up. I've never heard it before in any other context. Really, polyrepo is important to know in contrast with monorepo, because polyrepo is what we're typically used to. It's every project lives in a different repository. You pull in what you need into your project, and then you use it. And in reality, there's probably very few projects that ever exist entirely outside of that format, right? You're likely to pull in external libraries for anything you're building. But the goal that we were tasked with was breaking up what started as a monolith into something that we can work together and collaborate as a team. So the monorepo takes this large concept, puts it in one repository, which has some really key advantages. And the team at Narwhal actually has an entire website dedicated to explaining this concept and kind of making the pitch for it. And that's monorepo.tools if you want to check it out. But on there, they have this quote: "A monorepo is a single repository containing multiple distinct projects with well-defined relationships." So that's their definition of it. To put it in short, basically you can put dissimilar or very different things in one repository, but you still get some benefits that you would get from putting very like code together in one repository. Now, when I said about us being at scale, that was a huge part of our decision making, because if you look at this monorepo or polyrepo approach, and you think about something that's very modular or monolithic. Now, when you say monolith, that's almost entirely a negative connotation, right? That's not a good thing. It's not something we're trying to do. It's something we try to avoid. So when you're working on a solo project, you're probably keeping the scale small. So you might be in a single repository, and it might start to grow larger and larger, but that's okay. It's not the end of the world when you're the only engineer involved. That becomes very maintainable. When you make changes, you're making changes, and you're not worried about conflicting with others. So that becomes less of a concern. And then if you're building something that can be very small and it has a single purpose, common in open source projects, then you might be in a situation where tons and tons of people might be contributing. Say, an open source project has more people than even within your company likely. Then you have something that's very modular, and it doesn't end up growing too large, because new functionality would probably live in a totally different project and have different people working on it and may not relate on each other. So you can end up with a polyrepo solution in that direction, and it works well because everything's small and modular. So when things become large, but they also need a large number of contributors, that's where monorepo seems to be the proven solution, or at least the trade-off that many are willing to make. And so when we started digging into this, we discovered that Google, Stripe, Microsoft, Facebook are all taking this monorepo approach, right? So when you see it working for them, you of course need to be careful about, hey, I don't want to, I'm not Google, I'm not at that scale, I don't necessarily have all of their problems, but we are trending towards large, right? When we have a large number of contributors, we need to think about how others have approached scale. But what typically happens is until this decision is made to go this direction, you often end up with these monoliths, but also have a large number of contributors. And in that polyrepo approach, that's where we see most enterprise apps at, and there's a lot of pain points with that. And so with those polyrepo challenges, I've listed a few here, and there's of course more, but I think these are worth calling out. One of the challenges you have in these polyrepo situation is code sharing, right? So you could end up in a situation where you're duplicating code because you need that functionality in two places, and it can become cumbersome to make it somewhere else, a third place potentially, or having to import it back and forth between things that's not necessarily their responsibility. So code sharing is something that maybe is somewhat intuitive as a problem with the polyrepo. And then code duplication, as I just mentioned. Now, the other part is when you want to make a change that affects multiple repositories. Well, now you got to go into each repository, make that change, bump versions everywhere. It can become quite a headache. And then the other part here is, especially if we're talking about internal to a company, and you have a large number of people, once you build your familiarity with the tooling and everything else with a specific part of the app, it would be nice if we could jump to the next app, the next feature or library, and be familiar with it, be able to jump in and ramp up quickly. And that lack of consistency in tooling that you typically get in a polyrepo setup, that could become a challenge. So these are not exactly the opposite of before, but monorepo has some advantages as well, and that includes creating new projects without all the overhead, right? If you're just building a directory within there, you could intuit that you would have a little less setup involved than if you were to create another repository and all the build system and everything like that. And we'll dig in deeper because there's even more tooling available with NX that makes that even easier. And then what we said before about cross-repo changes, we can make these atomic commits that affect all sorts of things. Think about a UI library or something like that, right? It might be used widely throughout your company, different apps, all sorts of different places. If you make that one change, you can kind of make that one commit, and then everything is up to date, right? And so everything being up to date, we got to talk about versioning, right? So that can become a big thing. I know I have chased down so many issues where I'm just digging through and like, I think one of these package JSON changes is the source of my problem. I think there's something that's in the wrong version and it's causing compatibility issues. And I spend so much time doing that. Within the monorepo, you know everything works with your latest changes, right? It's all the same version, everything works together, everything plays nicely, all your automated testing, all of that works with that. So that's a huge advantage there. That's definitely what I wanted to call out. And then this is something I mentioned before, but the ramp-up time, when you hop from one place of the app to the other, it's very quick. It's the same build tools. It's the same, just about everything. It's even in the same repository. You're not jumping somewhere else. So being able to quickly jump into there and discoverability of code is huge. So these were all things that weighed into our decision making of should we go with a polyrepo approach or should we discover something in the monorepo solution that might work for us. However, yes?
Before you go any further, I'm not sure if you're going to go into this, but can you just say a little bit more about the difference between monorepo and monolith? Because I think I know what you mean, but I'm not really sure. I know I'm not sure I can take all this in without knowing it.
That's a great question. So the question is between monorepo and monolith. Basically, monorepo is meant to be structured. You might have entirely different apps, very many apps within one repository. And those apps are meant to be deployed separately, meant to operate independently. And then they are broken up further into libraries that support those apps. And hopefully some of those libraries are shared between different apps and they all live in one place. Whereas a monolith is typically one large project. Maybe it doesn't typically have that kind of structure. And, and the big thing with going with a monorepo approach, choosing tooling around it, is that there are specific guidelines and recommendations on how to structure your app, which kind of going back into what we were talking about, engineer ramp-up time. If you're familiar with these monorepo approaches, if you're familiar with NX, then you jump into another NX project and you're familiar with how things are broken down in general. It also can give you that intuition of this is something that should break out into another library/module, or this is something that should live in the main app. So that's how I see the difference. I'm sure other people have some other opinions there, but that's really the big separation. Does that answer your question? Awesome. Thank you. All right, so I've totally sold you on monorepos. Nothing could go wrong, right? All right, so there are some issues, right? Just like with a monolith, when it starts to get very large, especially when we're starting to put multiple apps in there, man, what about those build times, right? They're already taking a long time. I think this could be a real issue if we decide to make this repository bigger and bigger and bigger. What about testing? Automated testing. Man, my tests sometimes can take quite a while. I run through that bank of tests, and then I can only get up and get coffee so many times before I get jittery, right? So that can become a concern here. And then overall code organization. And I kind of gave this one away. You know, our tooling really helps give us a prescribed method to organize the code base in a consistent way. And then what about our dependencies? You know, I'm so comfortable going to package JSON, seeing everything that we're importing. I know where all those dependencies are coming from. I know what this app relies on. Well, are we going to have that problem with monorepo? Now this is a little different, right? So all these challenges exist there, and NX is here to save the day. So this is where NX comes in. NX is our toolkit that helps us tackle those issues that a monorepo creates. So we talked about the pros and cons. It seems overall worthwhile, but we just need to know where our vulnerabilities are. We need to address those specific problems. So how do we do that? And anytime you have a performance issue, you're probably leaning for that magic word of caching, right? There's probably caching that you can throw in somewhere and solve some problems. Well, with NX, it's smart. So NX is actually building a dependency tree, and it's aware of what is depending on what thing. And from there, it can figure out how to map all those dependencies, and it can cache small parts of the code. If that's all that's changed, that's all that gets busted, that's all that gets recreated in cache. And similarly, you can also run these items in parallel. So you can run some of these processes in parallel, and you can have them cached. So all of a sudden, you can have this huge code base. If you touch something small in this huge repository, you might still only have to bust cash for a small part, right? So that's the beauty here. That's what the tooling affords us, is we can operate kind of like some of the advantages of a polyrepo within this monorepo. Now, that's really cool technology. We can map this dependency automatically. Well, NX said, cool, let's do something fun with that. Let's visualize it. So there's actually a UI available with NX. You type in NX graph, bam, you get a visual representation of your dependencies. So this is a great at-a-glance thing, and if you've already got the power to map that, you might as well visualize it. So that's something that NX buys us. And another thing is the way it works is NX gives us a singular interface to run all of our commands. So we're talking about having multiple apps in one place. Well, part of the issue is when you pull up a new repository and it's got another app and you got to run it, what do you have to do? You got to go read through the README. It's like, okay, so how do we spin up this app? How do we run tests? And hopefully it's perfectly documented and everything is laid out really well in the README and you can figure it all out. In the cases that's not true, it's nice to have a little bit of guardrails to enforce that, and NX helps with that as well. And then we talked about that consistency in tooling, right? Well, here's the reality. You can say there's consistency in tooling, you can say that that's the recommended way, but you got to get all the engineers on board to do that, right? And how do you get engineers to do what you want? You make it really easy for them, right? You make it hard to do the wrong thing, easy to do the right thing. And so the way NX helps with that is through code generation. So we can get you started and scaffold the beginning of things with code gen. And the code gen is not super locked down to the NX way of doing things. While they provide a lot for you, they make it an open platform for you to create your own code generation. So you have your coding standards, your library organization, everything like that. You can build your templating in there, and you can have your automation to generate code. Now, a quick mention, NX itself has a high-level folder structure with two things that are kind of unique to this, and that's an apps directory and a libs directory. So apps, applications, that makes sense. We talked about having multiple applications in there. Those live in the apps directory. And then we have the concept of libs. Libs, of course, is short for libraries, but in this talk, because of the way my company started, we started with this code modularization task. So I use the word module and library interchangeably here. My team, module is what we've kind of used as our language, and then NX uses the language library. So if you hear those, I mean them interchangeably. So I'm going to go back into some of those details when we break down the exact process we've gone through, which is coming up. But I want to tell you where we started when we entered this journey. And basically, we were one very large engineering team, and we have one React Native app primarily. There are other things, but our division's focused on this one React Native app, and it was one large repository. You might even say a monolith. So that's where we started, and our problems were this kind of a lack of ownership of areas of the code. We knew subject matter experts, but unfortunately some of them were just, hey, that person knows everything about the app, so if you have a question, go to them. And that's unfair, right? We want to make sure that teams have ownership over what's relevant for their work, and then we want that clear delineation between the functionality of the application, so it becomes clear. That was really our task as our team. With code modularization, we wanted to break down the app and have that ownership and that clear definition. So we get a couple things. A team can understand what code is theirs, but others can also understand when code belongs somewhere or somewhere else. And that's the sort of thing that can be handled many different ways, and why we chose the monorepo to solve that problem. And so what was our goal with all of this? We wanted resources to be shared, reducing that code duplication, right? We wanted to enforce coding standards. So back to that engineering ramp-up time when you jump into something else. We wanted to improve delivery time. We wanted this to be a quicker process, and ramping up engineers quicker was part of that. This tooling's part of that. Performance benefits are part of that as well. And then we want to improve discoverability. So being able to dig through and find the relevant code quickly without, with an organized structure, right? Again, lots of ways we could solve that. Monorepo is going to be our solution for that here. So, over 100 engineers on one app. This has blown my mind. I've worked on little side projects, mobile apps, and it's you and your buddy. You might have some conflict issues sometimes, and you get right through it. But an app is kind of a difficult ecosystem to deal with a lot of engineers, and this is where it really brought up a challenge. So what our team focused on was, let's find this solution. Let's research what options are there, and now it's our task to establish a monorepo, because that's what we've decided we're moving forward with that. And so then, how do we manage that scale? And so this is the part of the talk where I'm shifting away from technical to very practical, because the reality is, in a large company, it's about this one phrase, change management. That is so huge, right? Because I don't know, am I the only one here that has put a survey out on Slack or some kind of internal communication that's in front of like 400 people and you get like 2 responses? So it's really difficult to get this kind of stuff out. So this is where I had to put my corporate hat on and learn how to do things the corporate way. I come from startups my entire career. And it's really, I found 2 levers I can pull. And that is with training and collaboration. So with training, I've even been digging in lately into Udemy with their business account. You can actually build Udemy courses, just like you'd take any kind of like masterclass or something like that. And it's a way to make taking in this content interactive and a little more enjoyable. When I first joined the company, and I've had this in other companies, they have this huge repository of so much great information. But I mean, how long can you sit there and just watch recordings of old meetings and read through tons of documentation and actually retain any of that, right? So having it being a little bit interactive is huge. So we had in-person workshops and some remote ones as well. We actually went through and I was like, I want to get you hands on keyboards, understanding how this works. And we went through some of the basics, like let's generate with some code gen through NX, let's create a new library. Let's see what that looks like. And we did that interactively. And that was really huge. We had those virtual presentations, and that was something that we could record and make available. And that was really helpful. It's available for training, but that's where we're evolving this into like the Udemy course. And it's pretty cool because you can go in, you can even do coding exercises, you can include slides, you can include recordings. It just helps people go through that. And then you throw a little quiz in there. And honestly, I've learned a lot through quizzes. It's totally okay to fail the first time. You go back through, there's explanations as to why. Sometimes that's even a more efficient way to learn because it's kind of practical, right? In real practice, you're making a decision, and then you may make the wrong decision. You get feedback as to why, and then you really retain that knowledge. So if you go and you fail a question in a quiz, and it tells you why, and you go back and you answer it correctly, it might stick a little bit better. So that's actually proved to be pretty useful. And then here's the key thing, right? Is as interactive and as gamified as I can make trying to teach you something, in reality, like, who am I, right? My title is senior software engineer. I'm not, architect down from the mountain. I'm going to teach you all that code has to offer. I'm just another part of our one team, right? So the huge thing here is collaboration. We have pushed really hard to say, hey, let us know. This is what we're thinking about. What are your thoughts? We want to make sure it's an open forum. We want to make sure that when we set coding standards, that everybody's on board with it, or at least has a time to voice their opinions. We want people to know that we're trying to push towards a structure, and we want to have a conversation as to how might this affect your workflow? How might this affect the work that you have coming down the pipe? So we wanted to make sure that it's not us telling them. We want it to be, we're going to carry the load of executing this, help us structure this in the best way. And that goes a long ways, and it's a little bit of like, hey, we gave you an opportunity. If you don't like it, you should have just been engaged. But in reality, it's been a great open conversation, and we've gotten a lot of good feedback, and it's really helped us form it. We don't have all the right answers. And it's been a real interesting task because my team has had lead engineers, senior engineers, mid-level engineers, but none of us are architects. None of us are, 20-year veterans of this kind of stuff, and we've built things from the ground up, been CTOs. We're not those people, but we still have to create this architecture for the whole company, right? And this is where it needs that collaboration, right? We bring people together. And honestly, that humble approach is so beneficial. I can't imagine being all the way up and not still wanting to lean into a humble approach, because it works better for the win friends and influence people, right? You got to take that approach when you get a big team moving. All right, so absolutely, what are we actually doing? What does this really look like? And we're touching everything in the app in order to do this, right? It's a full architecture change. So what's the temptation? Let's make this the best code of my life. Cool, that's great, but how much time do you really have? Can you actually go through and perfect everything and OCD your way through the whole app and just make it something you can be super proud of? We'd all love to do that, but in reality, we have to resist that temptation. Instead, what we focus on is co-locating code, because we got to think back to our goals. What were we trying to accomplish with that? We wanted to make sure that people knew the boundaries of where certain functionality existed, and we wanted to assign those to teams to have ownership over that portion of the code. So co-locating the code was a huge part of what could get us to those goals. And then maybe while we're in there, we could make some changes that make things more consistent, right? Because part of our goals were the quick engineering ramp-up time, right? We wanted to improve delivery times. So maybe we can make some tactical code changes that would keep us from having some of our linting errors, that would give us more sensible stuff, that would keep us from tripping over ourselves with some bad practices. So we decided we would make some syntactical code changes and kind of smooth everything through there in this process. And then this was the big part, is we had to have conversations about what goes where. Co-locating code sounds great, and it's a great thing to pitch, and leadership loves it, but what actually goes where? And we don't know everything. In fact, our team is fairly new. So we were jumping into a code base that none of us were experts on. And so we had to bring subject matter experts in from all around the app and have these conversations. What do we think fits, and what do we think doesn't? And then what's cool is, since we're on this learning journey as a team to learn everything about the app, this is our opportunity to lock that knowledge in as documentation. So wherever things weren't documented like they should, maybe this is our opportunity to improve those docs. So that worked out as a great part of this process. So this first phase of how we wanted to approach this, we defined this as lift and shift. And the big thing we had to push was like, hey, this isn't just moving things into different named folders. It's a little more. And I explained that approach, and that's a little different there. But here's what that exactly looked like. And that started with getting the right people in the room, like I just mentioned. We get those subject matter experts in, and we say, okay, we want to do analytics. What in our app has to do with analytics, and what needs to be moved over? So we'll talk about that. What we actually did is we came up with a spreadsheet, and we just listed out every single component or function, some page that needed to move over for that concept. And we wrote all those down, and then we went and looked into their dependencies, and this was like our pre-work. We go in there and say, hey, this is exposed outside of what we think would be in this app. This actually just stays internal within this library, this module. And then from there, we just do our first dry run of it. So we actually go through that spreadsheet, and we move all the files, and then what happens? Anybody guess? Everything breaks, exactly. And so now you can start to chase down those errors, and it tells you what you really need to move. Because you can look through it and scan through the app and spend a bunch of hours doing that, but at some point, you got to get in the code, start moving things around, start breaking things. And that worked out really well for us. So we broke the app, we moved the other things in, and then we had a really good idea. So we put that in as like our spike, right? And then after that, we pick up the full move. And that move including resolving all the imports, and then what I was just mentioning, we actually go in and apply all of our conventions in there. So one of the things we want to do is we've decided that we no longer want default exports, so something like that. We would go through, we'd remove all the default exports, and then that's something we can do in every file we touch. We make sure we run prettier on there, we're all on the same page. Now things are up to those syntax. And we've got a whole list of those things. And that document, going back to collaboration, is a working, living document. So as others help us out, they might notice something, hey, this is worth doing while we go there. we put in a ticket to catch up the stuff we've already moved, and then that becomes part of our process for everything going forward. And then, this is where things get real interesting, right? Testing. How do you test when you touch everything in the app and you're not a subject matter expert on it, right? You hope that you've got some automated testing, and you'd certainly lean on that. But what's interesting about this is since we made the decision to only make syntactical changes and move files and update references, we know where our risk areas are from these changes, right? Our risks are each of the user flows, each of the code paths that go into different files are going to be dependent on those imports. So we want to make sure those imports didn't have a typo, somehow broken, so we tackle that. Yes?
Just to clarify, were you guys moving from a monolith or a polyrepo situation to this situation?
Good question. So we actually started in a monolith, right? So we've got it all in the same repository to begin with, and then we are taking sections from that large app and moving them into libraries. Does that make sense? Yeah. I mentioned that we had a large app, but I wasn't real clear that that's what we're doing. Now, moving forward, we will be taking external things and pulling them in, but with our lift and shift, we're mainly trying to break up that main app into libraries, modules, as we call them.
This is all JavaScript code.
That's actually a good point. It's almost entirely JavaScript code, but we actually have some native code, and we had to support that as well. And I'm actually going to dive into that in a couple of slides. But the nice thing about NX is it is code agnostic, so you can move any kind of code into there, and it allows kind of all your structure to do your build process, to do your automation, to do the things you need to support whatever language that might be. For us, we've just done mostly like React, so mostly JavaScript, and then we've done some Java, Kotlin, Swift, Objective-C. Yes?
And so when you're moving this code from your monolith, your new NX project, was that living in the same repo as the monolith already, or did that require you to make a new NX repo?
Cool. Just in case the recording doesn't get the question. Question was, do we create this new NX repository and move everything over, or did we do that somehow in the existing one? And we actually did that. Is that what you're asking? Yes. So we did that in the existing one. And so that was our first scary change, right? Our first change was, okay, everything moves down a level. So now Sportsbook's the name of our app. Now it's app/Sportsbook, right? And that of course, creates some havoc because it's like, wait a minute, well, what about, what do I CD into this directory? Do I need to like run my commands from there? And then what about my build pipelines? They're expecting certain things. There were all those kinds of challenges. And the way NX likes to operate is that at the top level, you can run all your commands for all your apps and all your libraries. So it was a matter of porting those things up to the top level, updating all of our CI/CD to work with that, and then we were able to do it in place. And so everything we do, we're doing this process, specifically this lift and shift, thinking about how can we be least disruptive, because in the time that we were to do something, we might have 30 major changes drop in, right? So with that change, we made one quick thing to move everything down a level, and we said, okay, for the moment, you can just CD into that directory, run things like you used to. And then we could make changes where we start bringing things to the top level. Okay, now this works at the top level. This goes back to change management, right? It's hard to communicate all of that, but now everything's at the top level, and we put that in our training. We lock that into our documentation. People that are new to it now know the way, and we're just working on getting everybody caught up with that. So great question, and we thought about that. We thought about creating a new repository and kind of moving everything over, but that almost goes back into the same kind of challenges you have with a polyrepo. Now we're going to spend a long time with things split up into different places. And so that's a big part of your thought process, right? You could build something in this brilliant way, but what about between day one, you've just made the decision, to when it's done? And how do you continue to operate business as usual in the meantime? That was a big challenge there. And so we decided the trade-offs for us were it was worth staying within the one repository and approaching it that way. Great question. Thank you. And so I was saying about testing. Basically, our struggle here was we don't know this code necessarily. And so we had to tackle it as much as we'd love to go through, just like, let's make all the changes to make this code perfect. let's go through and write a bunch of automated tests. Let's go through and test everything every time. It's not realistic. So we were able to break down and look at, okay, what possible flows touch most of these files. Let's test those manually. Let's run all of our automated tests, and let's lean on that mostly. And as most large-scale companies, your rollout process, is slow. We're closely monitoring errors and alerts and things like that. So we're able to have some confidence that what we're doing has worked. And so far, we've moved a huge portion of the app, and no major issues related to it. And that's why, our changes were restricted to mostly syntactical things and these updated references. So that has worked very well for us, and as intimidating as it was to make these major changes, we've been able to do that without too much danger. All right, let's talk about those standards a little bit. Now there's, like I said before, you can talk from the mountain, but you're not going to get people on board to make those changes. So there's really two ways that I see that are useful. We're always referencing docs, right? So let's keep our docs up to date. Let's get that content in there. And then how easy can we make this so that people follow what we're asking everyone to get on board with? And that's through generators primarily. And NX really helps with this generator side. Creating apps and creating libraries is a quick command line call. You can say NX generate or NXG for short, and then component or library. And you can pull that from the NX ones, and out of the box, you can build things the NX way. We created our own generators for this, and those generators are defined within our repository. So you can go into that app, and you can pull, or that library, and you can pull that tooling out, and you can create libraries and apps the way that we want to. And that means you get all of the build process, you get all the testing, you get all the linting, you get our structure, you even get some basic docs that get generated. And then we even have it through a full CLI wizard. So when you go through there, you say, hey, I want this, and it's like, okay, well, give us a name, and it normalizes the name, and then like, do you need native support? So that was something mentioned, right? What other languages are we doing? And so we need some bridging code to make it possible to pull some of the native code out of its current folder structure into these libraries, into these modules. And so we built all that bridging code, and it generates it for your new library with one command. So we're not rethinking all of that, and now we get the benefits of the quick engineering ramp-up time, not only in going to go see something that's been created, but also even in creating it. Now, we really like, for documentation, we really like Docusaurus. I don't know has anybody used Docusaurus? Yeah. So what I like about it is the fact that it's version controlled with the app. Since it lives in the app, unlike we had so much of it on Confluence, and that was great, anybody could get to it, but the challenge there is you make a change there, you make a change in the app, it's kind of hard to keep that in sync. So I like the fact that it is version controlled. Now Docusaurus lives as a separate app within our repository, so we're really living the full monorepo life. And then we've gone through this process. We've created in Docusaurus a tab, and we've got each of our modules there. So each of our libraries has their own documentation home there, and we go through there and make sure we show you how to import from that app or from that library. We show you what its purpose is, and we tell you how you should decide whether or not something goes in that library or doesn't belong in that library. So that's the basics that we start with for the documentation for each of those. And of course, it's meant to be a starting point. So you have other relevant information, please include that there. So that's kind of how we approached it. And this stuff can be long living, and you don't have to ping me every day you want to make a change, right? We can make that live on. All right. So we talked about lift and shift. That's one part of it. So what does this whole rollout strategy look like? And that's what I mentioned before. The first step was we moved everything down a level. That enabled us to have the apps and libs and use all of that NX power that we get from that platform. And then we wanted to first create some of these libraries. So as a team, we picked some of the ones that would be core, because ultimately our team's going to be responsible for some of these core ones that are shared with everyone. And then we wanted to set up so that other teams could do what we've done, and now we can we can move mountains, right? Because we're one small team, there's only so much that we can do. Once we can start to multiply our efforts, we want to move there. But we want to do it first because we want to learn this. And because we haven't done it before, the way we break that down is we start with low-hanging fruit. Analytics was the first one we did, because for us, we actually had a pretty cleverly defined interface for our analytics. We can make an analytics call, it goes to one file, and based on the enum we use for that analytics call, we distribute it to all the relevant providers. So we might send some things to Sentry, some things to Google Analytics, et cetera, and we had that one interface. So we already had kind of a clear defined interface of how analytics interacts with the rest of the app. So we chose that as a perfect starting point because we could pretty cleanly decide which files need to move over. So that was the first library we pulled over, and then we added complexity each time. So a few modules later, we were ready to say, let's take one that requires native code, and then we tackled that problem next. So we kind of did this bit by bit so that we would have that understanding, and when other teams joined in, we could then have these generators already built to support all of these problems we've run into and solve all those issues. Now, here's a really scary thing with moving code around, right? You want to create a shared library. That sounds great, right? What happens with shared libraries? Everything gets stuffed in them, right? So that's the temptation there. So with shared modules, we had to have a very specific approach there to keep that safe. I'm going to go back into that if we've got time. But basically, we had to create strict rules around that to make sure that it didn't bloat and just absorb everything that people didn't want to find the appropriate place for. I have a shared module that's gone the wrong way at home. It's just a pile of stuff. It happens. And then we want to move those additional modules piece by piece. And our goal with all of this is the NX way of doing things. And that is that the app is really a shell. It should be quite small. It should be pulling in what it needs, and then it should operate. Whereas the individual functionality should live more like its own isolated module, and then in the future, it might be great for another app, or at the very least, the logic is contained in one place, and you make a change to that, your tests are associated with that, your automation's associated with that, and now we can gain that performance from the caching and the parallelization. The big thing to know here is that we kind of have to make this whole transition before we start to see a lot of those performance benefits. And why might that be? Our first big roadblock. This was the big challenge we ran into when we started doing this, something called circular dependencies. This has been the bane of our existence in this whole process. What you see here is we've got some arrows. This is what I was talking about, that awesome visualization tool that NX gives us. This is NX Graph. So this shows us our dependencies and how they relate to each other. And what you can see here very clearly, there's no problems here because it's analytics depends on Sportsbook, which is cool because Sportsbook depends on components, but components depends on analytics, and it also depends on Sportsbook, which also depends on analytics. Oh, not good. This causes build issues, all sorts of problems. It makes it very difficult. Sometimes things will crash entirely. It'll run slowly. Lots of problems around this. So how might we solve this circular dependency issue? Well, really, to solve any problem, you got to do two things. You have to identify it, and then you have to resolve it. So how do we even find these circular dependencies? Now, it's great that we saw those files and their relationship in that visual chart. But those are entire modules, right? There's tons of files in those modules that doesn't tell us enough about how to solve this. And so we found this tool that can be incredibly helpful for it called Madge. Very neat little logo, a bunch of vector stuff going on. It's not Adge, the M is part of it. It's called Madge. And then it also creates a visual representation, but this one will show us files. So now we're really breaking down the problem. We can find this much better when we see these file relationships. And then we can go in here, and we've got it alias through yarn, so I could say yarn circular, and then I choose that I want to look at the shared library, which, by the way, we're really diligent about the shared library, so there's no circular dependencies. Beautiful, love it. And then what about another one? Let's look at, this one is for, Sportsbook, the rest of the app. That's going to be clean, right? Absolutely not. And I cut that off because you don't want to read through the hundreds of errors that pulled up under there. So this is how we're able to identify those. And then we needed a strategy to resolve them. And realistically, circular dependencies are just, if you're going to group things in a certain way, you might inevitably have them. And the way that we can resolve them is we start to break things down even smaller. So this has been our main approach, is breaking down even smaller. And while there's a lot of different ways you can break it up, I think one of the most effective ways, one of the most Googleable ways, and one of the clearest ways to define this approach is through types. Because typically, types don't really depend on anything, right? Types are created, but they're used widely. Typically not just within the definition of their functionality, they're typically used in the implementation as well. So I think types is a great way to start, and it's also a great demonstration of how you might break things down. So part of this power is that we can alias to a smaller subsection of the library and then access that directly. Types often make sense to be their own library, so we have those options available to us. And I want to show you a little bit like what that might look like in code. So before we were to break it down, we might see something like this. So as you might imagine, we've got a very large library that is our component. So it's kind of our UI library, and it's widely available there. And you can see that you export everything from your components and export everything from your types. I'm sorry, this is not the components module. This is just a generic module. We call it whole module. And in there we have components and types broken out. And we would export all of those things from its index file. And then we might just need a type. So we'll pull this type in from @sportsbook. That's the NX way to alias something. We make that for our sportsbook app. And then whole module. So we're pulling in the whole module to grab this one type. And this, as you might imagine, is where we can start running into those circular dependency errors. But if we go in and we say, you know what, all I need to do is actually grab that type from the types library. So now under whole module in the libs directory, we've got types, and then its index file exports each individual thing that actually needs to leave that library, leave that folder, what is externally exposed. And then we'll pull that type out, and now we're importing from whole module /types. Now, I know this looks like just digging into a file specifically, but this is part of that NX magic, and this is treated as an alias to that module. So at this subdirectory, we're only pulling in types. So when TypeScript is going through and compiling things, it's not running into the issue. It's going straight to types, and it doesn't have the concerns that that type is also pulled in to its components there, and those components may not be used, and something in the app currently might be pulling from that component. So, like I said before, our concern is not just what the end state looks like. We have to be able to continue business as usual along the way. We're going to have some of these problems. So some of this breaking down into smaller modules might be a stopgap just to get us there. Others might make logical sense and need to live for the long term. But this has been our best approach to do that. So I told you before I wanted to mention a little bit about the shared module. I feel like I've got just enough time to do that. Again, this is NX Graph. We're seeing much more now. So this is further along down the process. Now we've got our shared library. We've got alerts, analytics, Sportsbook as the app, components as a module. It's our UI library. Coupons, which is a very specific term to us that honestly took about a month to figure out what coupons means. So this, welcome to big company stuff. It's hard to communicate a lot of that, but guess what? It no longer takes a month to figure it out because we left documentation behind. Please do that. If you take anything from this, please just continually update your documentation. And then we've got our live data and stats. So you can see here that shared may be used by each of these modules, but it is not dependent on anything. There are no circular dependencies there. And the way we chose to do that is in order for our components to be used in the different libraries and reduce these circular dependencies and have that maintainability, we put in two rules. If you go into the shared module, it must be used in multiple places, right? That makes sense. But second, it cannot import from anywhere else. It cannot import for other libraries. It cannot import from the app, certainly not the app that it's going to eventually be used in. It itself has to be pure. So those are the rules we put in place. And NX actually has some tagging and automated tooling that can help you enforce that. So it'll make sure that that's not possible. So this is a huge win for us, and it keeps this clean and tidy. And so like I said before, testing and builds are the big issue. And those caching and parallelization is that power that we're given to make this possible. And right now we're in this odd situation. Circular dependencies are keeping us from really realizing this because it's jumping around and has to build everything. So it's busting all that cache. And so this is an issue. And it becomes one of the really tough things because part of our pitch was that we're going to give these performance improvements to the app, and we can't fully realize that until we've moved most of everything over, which is the real solution to a lot of those circular dependencies, unfortunately. So we're starting to gain some of that power, especially in shared module and things like that, and where we can, but we're going to have those growing pains as we move through this transition. We spoke a little bit about native, and I mentioned before, we had to support being able to build the bridging code so that we can include the native code. So whatever special need you have for a specific language being included, other than your primary language or JavaScript as you typically interact, you would want to build that in with your generators so that you get that out of the box just as you start. And we've built that in with a wizard that you can select native support in that generation, and then that will allow you to get some of that out of the box. Yes, question?
I don't hold you up too much, but we have a native app, or a React Native app, and we've had trouble getting any kind of module from outside of some kind of container. I can't remember what it was several months ago, but it was like, it will not recognize anything outside of the React Native area. So how did you get it to import into that area? You know what I'm talking about? We thought of doing some kind of symlinking or something, but does NX support that, or did you have to solve that?
So I don't want to tell you wrong. I believe NX was part of the solution, but there's also, for web and for the build process, NX puts aliases in, and then it pulls it in like packages. And I think something similar is done with the native code, where it actually generates this as packages that can be pulled in the iOS way and be pulled in the Android way. And to be honest, the nuts and bolts of that, I'm not perfectly clear on. I don't want to tell you the wrong way. But NX is more so here facilitating the location of this and allowing you to build the bridging code you need to make that possible, and the aliasing code you need to make it possible, but you still have to go in and do your language-specific, your platform-specific stuff to make that work. The exact details, again, I'm not clear on, but if you'd like me to put you in touch with someone who worked on that more deeply, reach out to me afterwards. Thank you. And then, all right, so where do we go from here? And I'll leave you with this. We are planning to take some of what's in these libraries and make them available outside of our monorepo, right? Other things might need to access this. And NX gives us some tooling from that, but admittedly, that's not something we've approached yet. We just evaluated that it was possible, knowing that we're going to need that functionality one day. We have a couple of apps in there, but we anticipate that more apps from outside of our team within our company will get pulled in so they can gain some of these benefits that we've created, share a lot of our code. And then we continue to add these libraries, and we're going to add more and more of these libraries and continue to break things down. So that's what our roadmap starts to look like. That's a big part of how we've been approaching that. And so far, it's been a huge success. We've already seen some performance gains. We've seen people understanding things, and with a few survey responses we've been able to get, we've opened up those communication channels. So with that, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this talk. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to step up, and I'll answer those for you. Thank you.